Hello, Cassidy Clan members. Greetings from Australia. My name's Veronica Williams, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about DNA testing and making the most of your Cassidy DNA. And the Cassidy DNA is in you. I'm going to talk today a little bit about um, who to test, what to test, and why you should test, and next steps. So, making the most of your Cassidy DNA really depends on where your oldest Cassidy is positioned in the tree to determine what test you'll take. Now, for men, they have a number of options. They can take an autosomal DNA test, a Y-DNA test, or an mtDNA test, and I'll talk about these a little bit later. Females have only got the option of autosomal DNA because they don't actually have any Y DNA. The Y chromosome is inherently male, and but the females also have mtDNA. It really depends on, as I said, where you're positioned in the tree, and how much DNA you have will also vary. And I'll talk a bit more about this. So in terms of my Cassidy family, as you can see there's my tree, and my first Cassidy is Rebecca Cassidy, who was born in 1852. She's my great grandmother, so she's the first Cassidy I have in the tree, and you can see there that when you think about Cassidy DNA, or not just Cassidy DNA, any DNA, we get 50% from each of our parents. So I get 50% of my mother's DNA. I get only 25% of my grandmother's DNA, Mona Murphy. So essentially, I've probably only got at the maximum around about an average of 12.5% of Rebecca's DNA. So you can see there that the closer you get to your oldest Cassidy relative, it's best to test older relatives, such as my mother, who I have tested. Sadly, my grandmother is no longer alive. And going back even another generation, back to Thomas Cassidy, I would only have about 6.25% of his DNA. But remember, not all of your ancestors' autosomal DNA got to you. And this chart is what's called the porcupine chart. It was developed by Jim Bartlett, but it's meant to demonstrate to you how at each generation you lose DNA from the generation before, because we're constantly reducing the amount of DNA by 50%. And you can see there that the first few coloured rings are quite dark, which shows that in most cases you'll always have DNA relating to those three generations. So that's your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. And you can see there that at the great-grandparent level, 100% of the time you should match with second cousins who also share those great-grandparents. But the further we go back, the less chance there is of matching, and that's why those boxes start to fade. You can see there at the second great-grandparent level where you're matching with third cousins, we only match those 98% of the time. And the further you go out, the more difficult it is to match with other people, because as you can see there, some of our distant ancestors, we actually don't have any DNA. We've lost the DNA from them through a process that's called recombination, which I won't go through today. But I will tell you a little bit about the science of DNA. There's 4 types of DNA and 3 types of tests. And you need to understand this to know what test you might do. So I'm going to go through those now. So this is the example of DNA within a typical human cell. You don't need to understand this fully. All you need to know is to be able to understand that we have 4 types of DNA and where they sit. It doesn't really matter other than that. And what we know is in the nucleus we have a number of autosomes, and autosomes are the chromosome pairs you would have heard of already, of 1 to 22. And we inherit another chromosome pair, which is the sex chromosomes, which is an X or Y, depending on whether you're male or female, and that's often referred to as chromosome 23. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and we get one from each of our parents. So that's actually 46 different chromosomes when you're looking at your DNA results. So in terms of the actual DNA, the first type of DNA we have there is the autosomal DNA, which is chromosomes 1 to 22. X chromosome is the second type of DNA that you have. Now, women have two X's because they get one X from their mother and one X from their father. But men only have one X chromosome, and that's because they have the Y chromosome, which is a completely different chromosome as far as testing goes. So that's the third type of DNA. The fourth type of DNA is mitochondrial DNA. And as you can see there, mitochondrial DNA is different from the other three types of DNA in that it sits outside the nucleus. So what tests do you need to do? So an autosomal test, which is testing at all the main companies such as Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage and 23andMe, are testing the autosomes 1 to 22 plus the X chromosome. They're not testing the Y chromosome, even though it's in the nucleus of the cell. The only place you can get Y-DNA tests are at Family Tree DNA, and there are a number of different types of tests that you can take. Mitochondrial DNA, again, is only at ftDNA, and that's the fourth type of DNA, but it's a third test that you can take. So, which test is the best for your Cassidy ancestor? As far as autosomal goes, autosomal DNA tests can be taken by men and women, and in most cases I would suggest that this is the test you should take first. You can test at any of the major companies, and it doesn't matter whether your Cassidy ancestor was on your paternal line, your maternal line, or any of the other lines. And the autosomal tests are best up to about second great grandparents or third cousins. Beyond third cousins, you can find out a lot of information about these ancestors, but it's a lot more difficult and you need to do chromosome analysis. So I would recommend everyone doing an autosomal test first, and it's particularly important for people like myself whose Cassidy ancestor is not necessarily on their male line. We can still find out information about these ancestors through testing ourselves. So women can have tests. A lot of people still think that it's only a valid test for men, but autosomal tests are valid for both men and women. And you can get results from all those ancestors, and you can find matches and cousins who are related on all your ancestral lines. Now, the Y-DNA test is for men only, and as I said before, only men have the Y chromosome. So in this case, because my Thomas Cassidy is not on I'm not a male and I don't carry the Y chromosome, and I don't have any Cassidy cousins that I knew of that would share the DNA of Thomas Cassidy, I had to go out and search for someone to take the test for me. And this is what women need to do if you don't have any direct line ancestors to test. Try and find another cousin who is also descended from that ancestor to test for you. So you have to test at Family Tree DNA, and there's a number of tests you can take, but I would recommend testing as many markers as you can afford. And at the moment, the minimum number to test is 37 and up to 111. Or if you can afford it, try the Big Y. It is much more effective and gives you a lot more information. And the beauty about Y-DNA tests is that they can go back thousands of years, unlike the autosomals, which are only going back to second great grandparents, and a bit further with a bit of work. But these Y tests go back a long way. So remember, to do a Y test, the target ancestor, so in this case Thomas Cassidy, needs to be on the paternal line. So you can see Des there in the bottom corner. So we need to be looking for someone whose father's father's father is the target ancestor. So mitochondrial DNA is very similar to Y-DNA, except that it goes on the maternal line. So it must be on the mother's 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 line. Now, mtDNA is passed on by women to sons and daughters, but sons don't pass it on. So again, we have to test at family tree DNA, and you need to do a full sequence test. Again, this test can go back many thousands of years. Also, must be remember the target ancestor needs to be on the maternal line. So you can see in this example, my Rebecca Cassidy from myself is via my mother's mother's mother. But because mtDNA is also handed on to sons, I could have also had my uncle test, who's a male, but his mother's mother is also Rebecca Cassidy, so that would work as well. So it's a question of looking at who the target ancestor is and trying to work out whether you know someone in your immediate family who can test, or you have to go shopping for testers through family trees and contacting people who you may not know to get the right person to test. And that's how I found Des in the first place, and many other people I've asked to test over the years. So one thing I really wanted to stress was the fact that you really need to have a look at whether your Cassidy line is DNA confirmed before going and investing in Y-DNA tests. The reason I say this is that Y-DNA tests are quite expensive, and autosomal DNA tests are finding that a lot of people actually, once they do an autosomal test, they find that there's a problem with one of their lines. Now, I've experienced this, and many other people have experienced this. So we're recommending autosomal tests first, because 25% of testers find a break in one of their lines, and it might be 2 or 3 generations back where there's some sort of adoption or unexpected paternal event. So we want to make sure that we're researching the right ancestors, and you do actually belong to the Cassidy line, as well as making sure that if your Cassidy ancestor is definitely DNA confirmed and you're researching the right people, that you actually get the right tester to take the test. The main reason I say this is that you need to think about your investment in the Y-DNA tests and choose the right tester. So just as an example for my own family, my grandfather, Edward Roberts, we've always had a bit of a problem with his father, as his mother was married twice, and he was born in between when she split up with the first husband and before she married the second husband. Now, his birth certificate says Baker, but his all his life he's been called Roberts, and his middle name is Roberts. So we've always assumed he was a Roberts. But after many, many, many years of reviewing my DNA results and finding no matches to any of his Baker ancestors or any of his Roberts ancestors, we're finally at a point that I actually think he's named Di. So if I'd have gone out searching for a Baker or a Roberts to try and test the Y-DNA of my grandfather's line, I would have wasted my money, because I would have been testing someone who wasn't actually ever going to match. So it's important to try and find the right people to do the tests, and that's one of the reasons why I'm suggesting you do your autosomal test first. Make sure you're getting Cassidy matches, and then do your Y-DNA test, particularly if you're going to ask someone else to test for you and not an immediate family member whose results will be important to you anyway. So, which test should you take and where should you test it? There's 5 main companies, as you can see there on the screen. If you're going to do a Y-DNA test or an mtDNA test, you need to test at Family Tree DNA, as they are the only ones who currently do those tests. Whilst you can get an indicative haplogroup at Living DNA and 23andMe's, these are no good for doing extensive research and comparing with other people other than at a very basic level. So in terms of how you should approach your testing, I would recommend taking an Ancestry DNA test first, and the reason for this is that you can transfer the results of those tests to other places for free, but you can't transfer in from other places to Ancestry DNA. They don't allow it. So it's best to test at Ancestry so you've got your results there. They do have the largest database as well, and a preponderance of family trees, which makes it easier to trace people. But it's important that you then transfer those results to all the other sites so that you can get the maximum value for your test, and you potentially may find other people at other sites who have good matches with you that will help you in your research. The final place to test would be 23andMe, because like Ancestry, they don't allow any transfers in, so you would need to test with them separately. And of course it's open to test at every place without actually transferring, and sometimes the results for that are better, but this is the value for money testing path I'm suggesting. So tips for success: test the oldest living relative on your Cassidy line with an autosomal test. So autosomal tests are all the main companies: Ancestry, Family Tree, MyHeritage and 23andMe. Then transfer those results to those other places, particularly FTD and A and GEDmatch, because that's where we have some Cassidy DNA projects. Then, if you're happy that your Cassidy line is reasonably firm, both genealogically and genetically, then undertake some Y-DNA testing and test the oldest male with the Cassidy surname at Family Tree DNA, as I said before, as many markers as you can afford, or the big Y, and make sure you join the Cassidy FTDNA project. We also have a number of Facebook groups where you can communicate and collaborate with others, and I always recommend adding your Cassidy direct line to a one world tree such as WikiTree, so that connect the dots with other people and perhaps find other people who are researching the same ancestors. So if you've tested at Family Tree DNA, you may well have seen this screen. So anyone who's tested at Family Tree DNA and has Cassidy ancestry, I'd recommend you joining our project. Originally this project was a Y-DNA only project, but we've now expanded it to 21 with the Cassidy name as a way for us to connect with more people. And this is the home screen for the project on Family Tree DNA. And one of the things we try and do is to put a little bit more information on there about various members and who their ancestors are. And one of the things that Family Tree has is a searching tool where you can search for matches who in the project and find other people that perhaps might match you that you might not have been able to identify through just looking through your match list and things like that. So that can be a very useful tool. And we also have a combined Y-DNA surname results list, and this looks very complicated, but really you just need to look at the groups where those coloured lines are, and the people within those groups. So basically what we're trying to do here is to people who match each other, sort them into groups and try and find out who the most recent common ancestor is. We haven't had a lot of luck with all of those yet. You can see the Famana group down the bottom, which is my family. There's 4 people there, and we know pretty much how they're all connected, but they all come back to Famana. But some of the other groups are still over in the States and other places we haven't actually identified back in Ireland where they go to. But that's the goal, and the more information people provide us about their ancestry, the better we'll be. You can see some of those kits there have got a blank space in the paternal ancestor name. Well, that doesn't help us very much in terms of working as a project. So the more information you can provide, the better chance we have of trying to work with these results and identifying common groups. I mentioned before about transferring your results to GEDmatch, and GEDmatch is a third-party tool where people from different testing companies can upload their autosomal results. And it means that someone who tested at Ancestry can be compared with someone who tested at 23andMe, for example, without having to do 2 tests. So I'd recommend you join the GEDmatch. Firstly put your data on GEDmatch and then join the GEDmatch projects. And when you go to the home screen under the free tools, there's a menu bar at the bottom there. You can see ancestor projects, and when you go into there, just search for Cassidy and join our project, and this will enable you to do similar searches as the one at FTDNA, that you can look at all the people who are in the Cassidy project and see whether you match any of those. And they'll give you some information like this. It might look like gobbledygook to some of you, but this is showing matches in the project for myself and showing where I match particular people. There's more information of the person's name and email address and that sort of thing, but I've just cut that out for the purposes of this presentation. I also mentioned Wikitree, which is where I like to put all our Cassidy information, and I usually add the oldest ancestor to Wikitree if they aren't there already, and try and connect some of our members. And so I've created this page called Patriarchs of the Cassidy Clan, and this is the oldest ancestor of particular members, and you can see there that's an example of some of them. And they're all links to them in the family tree. So all those names that are underlined, you can click on those and go to that particular person on the Wikitree site. One of the great things about Wikitree is the tools. You see there that My Connections box. So if you've already uploaded all your family tree information, so I've uploaded all of mine from myself to all my ancestors, not just my Cassidy clan ancestors. But if you're at any of these boxes in Wikitree where there's a whole list of names, you can click on My Connections, and Wikitree will go through its search engines and find if you are related to any of these people in the list. So you can see there, once I clicked on that box, it came up with My Connections to the Patriarchs of the Cassidy clan, and you can see there that Stephen Cassidy, he is my ancestor, and he's the father of Thomas Cassidy, the grandfather of Rebecca Cassidy, and it says there he's an ancestor, so that's a direct line ancestor. And Owen Cassidy down the bottom is clearly also related to me, and he's an ancestor of Oliver, who's probably sitting there in the audience somewhere today. We also have a matriarchs page at the Cassidy at Wikitree for the Cassidy clan. We haven't got very many matriarchs on there at the moment, but so these are the oldest female Cassidys for members of our project. So if your oldest Cassidy ancestor is a female, that's fine. Just let us know her name as well, and we'll get her added to the site. I recommend that everyone try and add their own lines up to these ancestors, but I leave that up to members. It's not everyone actually wants to put their more current information down, but I recommend putting from at least your sort of grandparent or great grandparent, depending on how old you are, as long as they're deceased, and adding them onto the tree is a great way to connect with other people. As I said before, all of those links are live, and you can go to their page on Wikitree, and this is my page for my ancestor Stephen Cassidy. Another great thing about Wikitree is that the DNA connections, anyone who's already put their information on Wikitree and has done a DNA test, will show up on the ancestor's profile. So you can see there in the right in the green box. I have Des, my cousin, who I sought out to do the Y-DNA test for me. We have Oliver, who's there, who did a Y-DNA and matched with our family, so we're clearly related. And then there's a whole lot of other people down the bottom there that have taken autosomal tests. And you might want to contact some of these people if you don't already know about them. Now, in terms of communication, we have a couple of Facebook groups that I'd recommend people to join. The first one is the official Cassidy Clan, which is open to everybody, and this is a more general Cassidy site. The DNA group, Cassidy Clan DNA group, is open to anyone who's done a DNA test or is interested in testing. There are a few questions though that I ask as part of the application to join, and if you don't answer those, just make sure you read the fine print here, because your request will be declined. And this is mainly due to not wanting to have spammers or trolls and things like that getting onto the site. So it's to protect everybody in the group. Now, as part of this session, I prepared a bit of a blog post, which I believe Kerry has organised as a handout for today, which goes into a little bit more detail of what I've spoken about today. So that's my blog site there, and you should be able to use that link down the bottom there, or hopefully Kerry will have handed it out today. So thank you for your time, and I hope that's been informative for you, and if there's any questions, I'm hoping to be available depending on the time of day that we're running this. So as I'm doing it beforehand, I'm not quite sure about that. But please drop me a line, CassidyClanDNA@gmail.com, if you have any questions that haven't been answered today. Thank you.